All right, I think we have a critical mass back. I'm excited to introduce Tom Cotton to all of you. Tom Cotton has been a strong conservative since his arrival in the House last Congress. He's been an outspoken advocate for conservative policy proposals at home, while claiming ground as an articulate hawk on our security challenges abroad. His skepticism of the president's posture toward Iran, his strong support for America's relationship with Israel, and his leadership on renewing America's strength and leadership overseas have identified him as an emerging leader in our movement. More importantly, his personal experience as a combat infantry officer with completed combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan have informed him on our very real and personal level the nature of our enemies overseas. I think one thing that I actually think is pretty important to note here, we are very excited. We were very excited when we found out that he was coming to the Senate. As you may have read some clips about his race, and one of the things that I kept seeing recurring in some of these clips was some grumbling. And there was grumbling. There was one quote from a GOP consultant who complained that his voting record looked like a Heritage Action scorecard. And they were grumbling about it because they felt like he was putting himself in unnecessary political peril and made it harder for them to win a seat. But what has been so wonderful to see has been how Senator Cotton was able to go home to his constituents and articulate why he voted against a $1 trillion farm bill in an ag-heavy state, and how his constituents who care about ag embraced him and saw through a lot of the smokescreens that his opponent wanted to put up. He took a lot of hard votes, but he proved that when you take hard votes in Washington, the American people are more than willing to listen to you when you go home and articulate why you stood on principle. And then they'll rally to your side. So for that reason, we are pretty pumped to have him around because he proves the point that we've all been trying to make. And then last but not least, he's also a Heritage intern. A former Heritage intern, so one of our most distinguished interns, I would say the most distinguished intern. So congratulations. Please join me in welcoming Senator Cotton.
Appreciate it. Thank you, and thank you all for the kind welcome. Thank you for the generous introduction. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today to discuss a grave and continuing threat to America's national security: Iran's quest to become a nuclear power. A new Congress and a new majority was just sworn in. For many, these are heady and new times. But America's national security interests don't change with new Congresses or new majorities. It is the duty of leaders in both parties to protect these interests, always. For this reason, Congress will soon step up in one form or another and pass new Iran sanctions legislation. But we must not forget that legislation is not an end in itself. Sanctions are merely a means to stop Iran from becoming or obtaining nuclear weapons capabilities. It's not enough to stop Iran from getting the bomb. They must never be allowed to possess nuclear weapons capabilities of any kind. To understand why, before getting into the details of new sanctions legislation, we must remember who Iran is, what's at stake with respect to our policy towards Iran, and why President Obama's policy has failed to protect our interests. First, let's make no mistake about the nature of the regime we're dealing with. Iran is a radical, Islamist, tyrannical regime. Upon coming to power, among its first actions was to invade sovereign American territory, our embassy in Tehran, and to hold Americans hostage for over a year, an act of war for which it has never fully answered. The Iranian Constitution states that Iran's army and the Revolutionary Guard Corps, quote, will be responsible for fulfilling the ideological mission of jihad in God's way, that is, extending the sovereignty of God's law throughout the world, end quote. Perhaps more than our own leadership, the Ayatollahs have kept faith with their constitution. Iran has been killing Americans for over 35 years. In 1983, Iran helped finance and direct the bombings of the U.S. Embassy and Marine barracks in Beirut, killing hundreds of military, diplomatic, and intelligence personnel. In violation of all civilized norms, Iran helped plan and direct the hijacking of TWA Flight 847, which resulted in the death of a Navy diver. Iran has been implicated in the 1996 Gobar Tower bombings, which killed 19 Americans stationed at Saudi Arabia at the time. More recently, and more personally for me, Iran is responsible for the killing and maiming of thousands of American troops in Iraq and in Afghanistan. During my tour in Baghdad, Iran supplied the most advanced and most lethal roadside bombs being used against coalition forces. My soldiers and I knew that Iranian-supplied bombs were the one thing that our armored vehicles couldn't withstand. All we could do was hope that it wasn't our day to hit one. My platoon was lucky, but too many others were not. And to this day, President Obama's negotiating partner continues to collaborate in Afghanistan to kill American forces. Of course, Iran conducts many of these operations against America and our allies through terrorist proxies, as Iran remains the worst state sponsor of terrorism in the world, according to President Obama's own State Department. Iran is a lead financier and arms supplier to Hamas, Hezbollah, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, vile terrorist organization dedicated to destroying Israel. Iran has supported opposition Islamists in Yemen, and Iran has thousands of fighters on the ground today to prop up Bashar al-Assad's outlaw regime in Syria. Now, while Iran likes to boast that it has joined the fight against the Islamic State, it's done so only to protect Assad and has threatened to attack U.S. forces currently fighting against the Islamic State in Iraq if they were to target the Assad regime. Iran also holds hostage to this day, with impunity, multiple American citizens. Robert Levison has been held hostage for nearly 8 years, the longest hostage in American history. Pastor Saeed Abedini, who committed the grave sin in the eyes of Iran's Ayatollahs of converting from Islam to Christianity, today suffers in a notorious Iranian prison for preaching the gospel of Jesus. Amir Hekmati, a decorated American Marine and veteran of Iraq, was arrested in Iran while visiting his family there. And Jason Rezaian, a Washington Post correspondent, was detained just months ago for the apparent crime of committing journalism. Speaking of the press, much of the civilized world watched in horror last week as Islamist terrorists murdered journalists at Charlie Hebdo and Parisian Jews. But let's not forget that it was Iran who made it fashionable first to target for death in the name of Islam the practitioners of a free press and free speech. When Salman Rushdie published the Satanic Verses in 1988, it was Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, who issued a fatwa calling for the killing of Rushdie and his publishers. Think about that for a moment. Head of state put a bounty for murder on the head of a celebrated and prominent author. Khomeini's loyal successor and the current supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has reiterated this bounty. Yet this outlaw regime is now a negotiating partner of the United States. This catalog of Iran's crimes against the United States and the civilized world, and that was only a sampling, demands a policy of strength and courage towards Iran. But President Obama's policy has been marked by weakness and appeasement. Of course, then Senator Obama foreshadowed this policy in the 2008 campaign, saying that he would meet Khamenei without precondition. Here are his words. We're willing to talk about certain assurances in the context of them showing some good faith. I think it's important for us to send a signal that we are not hell-bent on regime change, just for the sake of regime change, but expect changes in behavior. And there are both carrots and there are sticks available to them for those changes in behavior. Regrettably, President Obama quickly followed through on his promise not to pursue regime change in 2009. Just months into his presidency, the Iranian people rose up in protest against rigged elections in what became known as the Green Revolution. President Obama should have met publicly with Iranian dissidents and, along with regional allies, assisted the pro-freedom elements in the opposition movement. Instead, he stood idly by as regime thugs murdered, rounded up, and tortured many freedom-loving Iranians. President Obama thus lost his first best chance to stop the Ayatollah's nuclear aggression. This failure started an all-carrot and no-stick policy towards Iran. President Obama was dragged kicking and screaming by Congress toward tighter sanctions against Iran. Like a love-struck teenager, he has sent 4 secret letters to Ayatollah Khamenei, unreturned and unrequited. Even worse, President Obama sought a meeting with Iran's second-rate leader, President Hassan Rouhani, last September in New York during the United Nations General Assembly, and Rouhani stiffed him. President Obama then accepted a phone call with Rouhani, the first contact between our country's presidents in 35 years, a tremendous victory for Iran for which the U.S. received nothing in return. Worst of all, of course, are the ongoing nuclear negotiations with Iran. The so-called Joint Plan of Action with Iran was signed in Geneva just over a year ago. Matters have gotten worse since then. The negotiations have now been extended twice, giving more concessions to Iran with little to show in return, despite Secretary of State John Kerry saying in September of 2013 that a deal could be reached in 3 to 6 months. Now, Secretary Kerry sings a different tune. He has backtracked from any timetable, saying recently, quote, "This takes time, the stakes are high, the issues are complicated and technical, and each decision affects other decisions." Meanwhile, based on published reports, U.S. negotiators have surrendered repeatedly to Iran's demands, conceding a right to enrich uranium, allowing Iran to keep its plutonium-producing reactor, asking only that its centrifuges be disconnected instead of dismantled, permitting research and development into advanced centrifuges, excluding the military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program and its ballistic missile program from the scope of the negotiations, and even agreeing to an expiration date for any final deal. In return for all of these concessions to Iran, the U.S. has given and will give billions of dollars in sanctions relief. What's wrong with this picture of negotiations? What started as an unwise policy has now descended into a dangerous farce. One can only suspect an unspoken entente between the Obama administration and Iran. The U.S. won't impose new sanctions on Iran and will allow it to develop threshold nuclear capabilities, while Iran won't assemble a bomb until 2017. But the world cannot accept Iran as a nuclear threshold state, and the consequences of a nuclear Iran are clear. First, we should put nothing past this rogue state, including a direct strike on the little Satan, Israel, or the great Satan, America. Nor should we think Iran would hesitate to provide nuclear materials and technology to its terrorist proxies. Of course, Sunni Arab states like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE likely will not countenance such a radical imbalance of power with their Shia Persian rival. They would likely seek nuclear weapons of their own, and they have the means to acquire them. Once that occurs, nuclear proliferations to terrorists, Sunni and Shia alike, becomes all the more likely. Not to mention the risk of radical Islamist revolution in an unstable nuclear region. The consequences, quite literally, are apocalyptic. Future generations may therefore view what happened in Geneva as we have viewed Munich for the last 75 years. What made this moment even worse, though, is that the West appeased Hitler at Munich out of fear and weakness. President Obama capitulated at Geneva, even though the United States was in a position of strength, given the sanctions regime in place at the time. One can only imagine the thinking behind this grievous historic mistake. We thus need a shift in policy toward Iran, to a clear-eyed and hard-nosed policy of strength based on America's interest and the threat posed by Iran. First, the goal of our policy must be clear: regime change in Iran. We cannot and will not be safe as long as Islamist despots rule in Iran. The policy of the United States should therefore be to support regime opponents and promote a constitutional government at peace with the United States, Israel, and the world. This is so because of the nature of Iran's regime is what makes its pursuit of nuclear weapons capability so dangerous in the first place. Few people worry that France is a nuclear state or that Japan is a nuclear threshold state. Why? Because France and Japan are peaceful, constitutional regimes who pose little threat to their neighbors and the broader world. Iran's regime poses a threat not primarily because of its actions, but because of its nature and the first principles on which it acts. Second, the United States should cease all appeasement, conciliation, and concessions towards Iran, starting with these sham nuclear negotiations. Certain voices call for congressional restraint, urging Congress not to act now, lest Iran walk away from the negotiating table, undermining the fabled yet always absent moderates in Iran. But the end of these negotiations isn't an unintended consequence of congressional action. It is very much an intended consequence, a feature, not a bug, so to speak. Third, congressional action should start with crippling new sanctions against Iran. These sanctions should be immediate. They should not be contingent on further negotiations with Iran. On the contrary, Iran is achieving through slow motion all that it might want in a final deal, exploiting the Obama administration's desperation to keep the negotiations alive and for a deal. Any deal. It's time for the responsible adults in both parties of Congress to stop this farce. Risking our national security to secure a presidential legacy is an unacceptable compromise. The particulars of new sanctions can be seen in the bipartisan Nuclear Iran Prevention Act, which passed the House in 2013 with 400 votes. That legislation targeted whole sectors of Iran's economy, particularly its oil and gas and banking sectors. Likewise, Senators Kirk and Menendez are working on legislation that would crack down on Iran's oil industry, which continues to violate limits on the volume of oil sold. The Kirk-Menendez proposals would also require President Obama to certify that Iran doesn't finance terrorist groups that have attacked Americans and would prevent Iran from maintaining low-level nuclear enrichment capabilities. All of these terms are much stricter than the current proposed framework of the negotiations with Iran. Fourth, we should stop minimizing the possibility of military action against Iran. The credible threat of force only strengthens our other tools of national power: diplomatic, economic, financial. No one should ever take lightly the prospect of military action. I certainly do not. Only those who have not tasted war's bitter cup would wish another sip. But the surest way to preserve the peace and to prevent war is to be prepared for war, and we must be prepared to do whatever is necessary to stop Iran from obtaining nuclear capabilities. President Obama should make it utterly clear that Iran is not immune from military strikes and that the United States has the capabilities to severely set back Iran's nuclear program, because we do. Unfortunately, this president's promises of military action have rung hollow since he blinked and refused to enforce his own red line against Syria in 2013. Thus, it may be up to the Congress to restore the credible threat of force against Iran. And Congress can do that, not only by imposing new sanctions, but also by offering to transfer advanced weapons like surplus B-52 bombers and 30,000-pound bunker-busting bombs to Israel. Perhaps Israel already has the capabilities to retard Iran's nuclear program. I leave that assessment in the capable hands of the government of Israel. But a congressional offer, whether or not accepted, can remove any doubts in the mind of Iran's ayatollahs. Finally, our policy should make clear that there is only one acceptable outcome to the nuclear showdown with Iran: complete, unconditional nuclear disarmament by Iran, subject to unfettered, on-site verification by U.S. and Western officials, along the lines of disarmament by South Africa and Libya. Lesser terms will not fully protect America from the threat posed by a nuclear Iran. Which raises one final important point. President Obama has shown no intent to change his dangerous course, to shift his policy of conciliation and peace through weakness. On the contrary, he started negotiations without congressional input and apparently intends to avoid Senate ratification of any final agreement, if he ever reaches one. This end run would be of a piece with his unlawful amnesty decree, selective enforcement of Obamacare, and his swap of 5 Taliban commanders detained at Guantanamo Bay for an American soldier without congressional notification. But any unilateral agreement with Iran might be his worst abuse yet of his executive power and our constitutional system of checks and balances. The founders specifically required Senate notification of such agreements to protect Americans from rash, unwise executive action, perhaps taken more to secure a legacy than to secure America's interests. Congress should therefore insist, as our new leadership has, that we will vote on any final nuclear agreement with Iran. While our president believes he can go it alone to negotiate this deal, ultimately only Congress has the constitutional power to permanently lift sanctions on Iran. And if the president believes he can go it alone with Iran, Congress should act to prevent him from doing so. Indeed, we might even go so far as legislating that any deal found unacceptable would be undone and void at the start of a new administration. In late 1936, Churchill made a long speech on the years of British appeasement in the face of German rearmament. Churchill observed, quote, "The era of procrastination, of half measures, of soothing and baffling expedients, of delays, is coming to a close. In its place, we are entering a period of consequences." So too with us today. As Iran continues its progress towards nuclear weapons capability, as its economy rebounds from earlier sanctions, as its regional influence waxes and as Barack Obama's tenure wanes, our choices will be clarified, and the consequences along with them. Let us not join our ancestors in being asked by future generations, why didn't they do something? Thank you all. I appreciate your time. I wish I could stay for questions, but I have to go back for hearings on this very matter. Appreciate it.
Well, that was great. Thank you very much. Okay, I would like to invite our panel up now to have a discussion about this. Bruce Klinger is our Senior Research Fellow in Northeast Asia here at the Heritage Foundation. Jim Phillips is a Senior Research Fellow for Middle Eastern Affairs here at Heritage. And Anna Quintana is our Research Associate in Latin America here at the Heritage Foundation. I'll turn it over to Bruce to moderate the panel.
All right, well, thank you very much. We're here to talk about 3 rogue regimes whose motto might be opportunity for none and favoritism to just a few. And we're to cover 3 rogue regimes, Iran, Cuba, and North Korea, in about 25 minutes. So brace yourselves. We're going to talk quickly, and it'll be sort of like the audience having to run down a buffet line as 3 chefs pelt you with what we think are the most important things or the best tasting things. But the good news is you always can come back for more. We'll hang around during the break, and you can talk to us or look at the papers that I think have been left out on the table outside. What I'm going to do is try to debunk very quickly a few of the myths about North Korea sanctions. The first is that the U.S. and other nations face a policy choice between sanctions and diplomacy. And really, both of those, along with the other instruments of national power, should be used in an integrated, comprehensive manner. You don't rely on any one tool, and diplomacy and sanctions are really 2 sides of the same coin. As Frederick the Great said, diplomacy without arms is like music without instruments. You need all of them. The second myth is that sanctions can't affect an isolated country like North Korea. Well, even the most isolated regime or terrorist group or criminal group, its money has to cross borders at some point, in suitcases full of cash, which is suspicious and inefficient, or digitally. And because of the centrality of the U.S. dollar to the international financial system, the vast majority, some say 95%, of all international transactions are done denominated in dollars. And that means they have to go through a U.S. bank, which is regulated by the U.S. Treasury Department. If you transfer money from Australia to England, if it's denominated in dollars, it goes through New York. And because of that, It allows the U.S. to regulate and oversee any account, including correspondent accounts of overseas entities, and you can fine them. The British bank was fined $2 billion for money laundering, including with Iran. A French bank faced fines of $9 billion, and the assets can be seized under the U.S. Patriot Act. And also, and even perhaps most importantly, any entity that is found to be a money laundering concern is precluded from engaging in the U.S. financial system. That's like a financial scarlet letter, and no one will want to deal with you. A third myth is that North Korea is the most heavily sanctioned country in the world. You see that in virtually every media article. It's simply not true. The U.S., EU, and UN impose stronger sanctions and targeted financial measures on Iran, more than North Korea. And that's one of the reasons Tehran came back to the negotiating table. The U.S. itself has unilaterally has more entities on its sanctions list from the Balkans, Cuba, Iran, Burma, and even Zimbabwe than North Korean entities. We have nearly 3 times as many Zimbabwe entities on the U.S. sanctions list as North Korean entities. Fourth, there's nothing more the U.S. can do on North Korea. Again, you'll see that often in the media. And again, that's not true. The U.S. has a number of existing laws and regulations that we've simply not applied as firmly towards North Korea as we have to other nations. President Obama, the former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, et cetera, have all said there are other measures that we're contemplating. Some of them are blood-curdling, and yet we still wait a year or more after some of these statements. A fifth sanction, or a fifth myth, sanctions don't work on North Korea. Well, they do. We had an extensive program in 2005 against a Macau bank called Banco Delta Asia, where in conjunction with the U.S. Treasury Department announcing it as a money laundering concern, there were a number of private meetings with U.S. officials throughout Asia with businesses and banks. It led to over 24 entities no longer willing to do business with North Korea. A North Korean negotiator told a White House official, "You finally found a way to hurt us." And the Obama administration came in office saying it was a huge mistake for the Bush administration to have removed those sanctions, which we did in trying to improve the atmosphere for nuclear negotiations. And the Obama administration has said they're trying to recreate the pressure that the U.S. had in 2005. What are some of these things that we can do, that the U.S. can do under existing law? We can put North Korea back on the state sponsors of terrorism list. We can designate them as a primary money laundering concern, as we have Iran, Burma, and Ukraine. We can formally charge them as a currency counterfeit. Treasury Department says they're the ones behind the super notes, the $100 bills. We can impose human rights-related sanctions on them, as we already have on Zimbabwe and Congo. The presidents of Zimbabwe and Congo are on a U.S. sanctions list because of human rights violations. And yet, 11 months after a UN commission concluded that North Korea had committed crimes against humanity because of their widespread systemic human rights violations, the U.S. has done nothing on North Korean human rights. And actually, the list goes on. So what I would say in conclusion is, I'll leave you with a question, is why would the U.S. hesitate to impose the same measures on North Korea that we've already applied on other countries for far less egregious violations? So thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to Anna to talk about Cuba.
Yeah, so a great way of understanding the president's new dangerous policy towards Cuba, these weakening of sanctions, is really to look at the past and look at what previous administrations have done, particularly the Carter and Clinton administration, and how the Cuban government has responded aggressively. And then we have to look at the present, see exactly how sanctions have been weakened, and not so much as weakened, and see the unilateral concessions that have been granted towards the Castro regime, and how that's going to end up effectively undermining our national security and our interests in seeing a free and democratic Cuba. So Carter reestablished diplomatic relations with the Castro regime in '77, and he was pursuing going even further than creating a section of interest and allowing them to create a reciprocal section of interest when the Cuban government launched expeditionary forces in over 12 dozen countries, in over a dozen countries in Africa. What they called liberation movements were really leftist insurgencies, right? And then Clinton in '94 and '95 wanted to create better conditions for for improving relations, because every president thinks that they can be the one to improve relations with the Castro regime, which is they obviously didn't, right? So in doing so, they created this perception of weakness, and any weakness towards the regime is provocative. So the regime responded with downing the Brothers to the Rescue flights in 1996, which 3 Americans were killed and 1 U.S. resident was killed in international waters. This is when Congress responded with the whole overwhelmingly bipartisan support of the Helms-Burton Act, which is also known as the Cuban Liberty and Democracy Act. This now put the embargo and international sanctions completely under the purview of Congress. So now you need congressional authorization to lift the embargo. Right, and you also had a strengthening of international sanctions. So now moving forward to the president's new policy. So he has now created, and this is without demanding absolutely anything. He demanded nothing of the Castro regime. This is the United States essentially bending over backwards, despite the fact that, according to Helms-Burton, Cuba needs to pursue free and fair elections, needs to release all political prisoners, needs to allow for the establishment of labor unions, right? Just needs to create a free and fair Cuba, which is obviously not in their interest. So the president has now, after 18 months of secret negotiations in which they did not involve the State Department, this was all conducted out of the White House, and the White House the NSC fully admits to this, has decided to do really 3 things, to normalize relations. Cuba can now have the Castro regime can now have an ambassador in the United States. They have now essentially been absolved of over half a century of aggression towards the United States and towards its own people, and towards the aggression that they fostered throughout Africa and throughout Latin America. They can now have an ambassador here. President Obama has gone even as far as calling Raul Castro president. He's calling him President Castro. This is someone who was never elected. This is someone who the only reason why he's in power is because he's the younger brother of Fidel Castro, another individual who has never been elected. So President Obama is now also expanding the ability for Americans to travel as tourism. Before it's extremely difficult for an American to travel to Cuba. Me as a Cuban American, it was difficult for me before there was a restriction. You could only go once every 3 years. Now that's just been completely obliterated for Cuban Americans, and for Americans, it's going to be extremely easy for them to travel as well. But what people need to realize, and what I don't think the president is making public, is that the military controls the tourism industry from top to bottom. From the hotel you're staying at, from the rum you're going to be drinking, from the cigars you'll be smoking, that is all controlled by the military, and that's all additional revenue that's going to the military. And another area that's been weakened is remittances. So Cuban Americans would send to the island about $3 billion annually in remittances. And this is when the cap was, previously before Obama changed it, the cap was at $500 per quarter in remittances that were sent. The Cuban government taxes that at 20%. So that $3 billion, 20% is taxed right up front. Then another 20% is taxed once that's converted from U.S. currency to the local currency. At $3 billion annually, that's an over $700 million in profit that they're making. Imagine now, from $500, that's been quadrupled to $2,000 every quarter. Now we need to multiply 700 million by 4. That's additional hard currency that's going straight into the hands of the regime. What incentive do they have to change now? Absolutely none. We have given a dying regime a lifeline, right, to continue their aggressiveness towards us and towards the Cuban people. 2 days after Obama made his announcement, Raul Castro stood in front of the National Assembly in full military garb, stating that Cuba from now on, despite its new relationship with the United States, will remain a communist country and will never change. Cuba will never see democracy. So now we need to look at this in terms of what are the broader implications, right? What's going to be the future of U.S.-Cuba relations if this regime is accountable to no one? We have put absolutely no conditions on these negotiations. They have nothing to be responsible for. And then really, what's going to be the future of democracy on the island? Congress needs to make sure that State Department programming, that we continue supporting the peaceful opposition, that we continue supporting the democratic opposition on the island. And it appears to be that the State Department is reorienting their democracy promotion programs to suit these normalization measures, right? So then, and we also need to look at what are the implications for future negotiations with rogue regimes like North Korea and Iran. If all of this was conducted in secret, if we granted these wide sweeping overtures, we just gave them a gift basket of goodies, what are they going to do to Iran with Iran and North Korea? So with that, I pass it on to Jim.
I'd like to say a few words about Iranian sanctions. This year, the long-running negotiations with Iran on the nuclear issue are expected to come to a climax one way or the other. I think Congress can play a very helpful role in crafting sanctions that would not only enhance U.S. bargaining leverage, but also deter Iran from pulling a diplomatic rope-a-dope by stretching out negotiations while it continues to advance its nuclear program. From the beginning, the Obama administration, I think, has failed to grasp the essential nature of Iran's Islamist dictatorship. In his inaugural speech, the president proclaimed that to Iran and other dictatorships that we will extend a hand if you are willing to unclench your fist. This engagement policy, I think, reflected a very naive and wishful thinking. The administration failed to understand that the unpopular regime in Iran could not unclench its fist over its own people without risking being overthrown. And this became clear in June 2009 when the opposition Green Movement orchestrated protests against the regime, which were brutally suppressed. The White House missed the opportunity to stand with and support the Iranian people. It preferred to ignore the Green Movement in a vain effort to strike a deal with the regime over the heads of its own repressed people. And it failed to understand that the hostile ideological motivation of the regime, which sees itself not as a typical country, but as the vanguard of a global Islamist revolution. Anti-Americanism is part of its ideological DNA, and that's why it calls the U.S. the Great Satan. It continues to stage demonstrations in which their supporters chant "Death to America." The administration, unfortunately, has treated Iran like just another country and offers to reward the regime by allowing it to rejoin the international community. But that's the last thing that Iran dictators want, because they've invested so heavily in their self-proclaimed leadership of the global Islamic revolution that a genuine reconciliation with the U.S. and the West would spark an ideological crisis that could undermine its own legitimacy. The Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has repeatedly warned against too much contact with the West and West toxification, and continues to warn against a velvet revolution. Islamist totalitarians by nature reject compromise, and instead Iran has sought sanctions relief in the negotiations without compromising its ability to eventually build a nuclear weapon. The Supreme Leader's red lines have made it clear that Iran will not dismantle its nuclear infrastructure. In fact, it demands the right to build thousands of more centrifuges, which would further reduce the time it needs to stage a nuclear breakout. Iran is slow-walking the negotiations, which already have missed two deadlines in July and November, and actually, Iran's been negotiating in some form or other since 2002. So if you count all those failed negotiations, there's reason to suspect that these negotiations are not going to ultimately go too well. Iran continues to stall on concessions, convinced it will get a better deal. Meanwhile, the administration is bending over backwards to get a deal that it hopes will burnish its legacy. It's made major compromises in several sensitive areas, including accepting uranium enrichment, which was banned by multiple UN Security Council resolutions. It's retreated from demands on Iran closing its illicit nuclear facilities at Natanz, at Fordo, and at Arak. And it's backed away from demanding full Iranian cooperation with the ongoing IAEA investigation into the possible military dimensions of its program. Iran has obtained substantial sanctions relief in exchange for symbolic and incremental concessions that can be easily withdrawn, as it has many times in the past. One of the biggest mistakes the administration made was in prematurely relaxing economic sanctions against Iran, which undermined its own bargaining leverage. Sanctions are the only reason that Iran came to the table in the first place, and many of them were imposed over the objections of the administration. Thanks to sanctions relief, Iran has increased its oil exports from 1 million barrels a day before the November 2013 interim agreement to about 1.4 million barrels a day this past November. That has added about $10 billion to Iran's annual oil revenues. The Iranian economy grew an estimated 4.6% at the beginning in the first quarter of Iran's calendar year, and this is the first time it's grown after shrinking the last 2 years under sanctions. The bottom line is that this has reduced the incentives of Tehran to negotiate in good faith and increased its willingness to engage in open-ended diplomacy while continuing to advance its nuclear program through research and development. Congress can help to remedy this situation by putting in place sanctions that would be imposed if Iran violates the interim agreement or fails to negotiate an acceptable final agreement within a reasonable amount of time. There's strong bipartisan support for a tougher negotiating policy, and a likely vehicle for expressing this support is the Kirk-Menendez bill, which would ratchet up sanctions on Iran's oil exports and strategic sectors of the Iranian economy if it violates the interim accord or drags its feet further on a final agreement. Senator Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader in the last Congress, blocked consideration of this bill last year, but the Senate Banking Committee is expected to approve a version of it soon. Congress should weigh in on any proposed nuclear deal. The chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Corker, reportedly is working with Senator Lindsey Graham to draft legislation that would require the president to submit any deal to Congress within 3 days. Congress would hold hearings and have an additional 15 days to vote on the agreement. Congress also should exercise its oversight powers and hold hearings to make sure that the administration continues to prosecute sanctions violators, because if the U.S. starts going limp on these sanctions, other countries are sure to follow. Finally, Congress can also play a role in educating the public about the nature of the Iranian regime and its long record of violating the human rights of its own people, while functioning as the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism. After all, it's the nature of the Iranian regime and the threat it poses that makes the Iran nuclear issue such an important one. And let me just
All right, well,
back to
thank
Bruce.
you. We sort of ran around the world very quickly, or at least the rogue regime part of it. So we have a few minutes for questions, although I've been told we have a hard stop at the end. So if anyone wants to raise their hand, and please wait for a microphone. Right down here, sir.
Given that I agree with each of the foreign policy goals, say in Cuba or Iran or North Korea or Zimbabwe or the Balkans, I challenge the notion that sanctions are the effective remedy. I wonder if any of you can point to an instance when sanctions have actually changed behavior of a regime and accomplished our foreign policy objectives. We've created OFAC, an international bureaucracy devoted to imposing and enforcing these sanctions, imposes billions of dollars of regulatory burden on U.S. industry. I wonder whether sanctions, in fact, are the proper remedy to these foreign policy problems.
Maybe I'll take a crack. As I tried to point out in the beginning, it's not an either or. It should be used in conjunction. So one wouldn't necessarily point to any one tool of U.S. foreign policy as the tool which brought it about. I mean, certainly the South African apartheid regime was, I think, heavily influenced by official and non-government and private sanctions. And also there's targeted financial measures, which is what goes after the criminals, not the people themselves. I'd point out, targeted financial measures or sanctions more broadly really have a number of objectives. I'd say there are 5 objectives. One is upholding U.S. law. If we don't uphold or defend our laws, then they're meaningless. 2 would be you're imposing a penalty or a cost on those that violate U.S. law. And again, that's targeted financial measures as opposed to sanctions. 3, you're trying to constrain the inflow of prohibited items into a country like North Korea, including financing from their illicit activities. 4, you're trying to prevent or at least reduce the proliferation of prohibited items under UN Security Council resolutions. And 5, the most difficult, along with the other tools of national power, you're trying to alter their behavior, modify their behavior, in North Korea's case, getting them to abide by their signatures on 8 or more international agreements and not to have nuclear weapons. So I think we need to look at it more broadly in context of a broader sanctions or a broader foreign policy. All right, down here in front.
I reject the expression that I hear all the time in the news, I've heard it here today, that Obama is building his legacy in doing all these different things he's doing, things that go against the best interests of the United States and its people. And it disheartens me to hear people use that term. He is very wholeheartedly, determinedly pursuing policies that are hurting this country. I would not call it building a legacy. I would say hurting America. There's a more linguistically appropriate way to say that, but words have consequences. And by saying that, we build an excuse for him. We misrepresent his intentions to the people of America. And for this country to change and to get on the correct path, we must be well aware of what we are facing from leadership as well as from without.
Well, I would agree with that. I would agree with that, and I think we were using shorthand because I would agree the real danger is in Iran is that his legacy will be a nuclear Iran.
Well, we've unfortunately just gotten the signal we have to bring our panel to a close. Perhaps it's a sign of success if we've run out of time before we ran out of questions. So thank you all very much. Thank you.